Well, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Rita, for hosting these opportunities to share practices with one another. I am hopeful that actually some of you will chime in and share your practices as well. Rita and I went back and forth on a couple of different options for what to present today. So I've been teaching, my name is Katayoun, Chamany, and I'm a professor of biology. I've been teaching at the New School for 25 years. This is going to be my 26th year. So I've been teaching here for a while, and the technique that I'm going to be talking about today is really designed to try to meet each student in your classroom where they are, but also give you an opportunity to really reach those students who often I find can be very challenging to engage in an individual sort of customized dialogue. So I'm sure many of you have this experience. You have a lot of students who are in the classroom, maybe 3 or 4 are avidly speaking in the classroom or coming and seeking you out during office hours or other kinds of engagement. But the vast majority are quiet, brilliant, but you don't really know what's going on in their minds. And so I developed this assignment some years ago, actually as part of the summer bridge program for the Higher Education Opportunity Program. And it worked really well in that context. And so I adapted it and adopted it for all of my courses. And at first, I only used it in my first year seminar at Lang, which is designed for freshmen, which is also an advising situation. So the faculty member is both the academic advisor, faculty advisor for the student, as well as the instructor for a course that looks at many different nodes and modalities. And then I realized, wow, it works really well there. I could probably employ this in all of my courses. So I wanted to start with the impact first. The reason why I've put this into all of my courses is because it is actually my favorite assignment to look at in terms of student work. So I really look forward to reading these every week, which when you've got a lot of stacks of papers or products or creative works to review, it can sometimes be overwhelming. You're not always excited. But for these, I'm excited every week because I really get to see something inside my students that I wouldn't normally get to see in the classroom or in the work that they create. It's much more about their process and their metacognition, which is the title of today's presentation. So what I'm going to do now is switch up a little bit. I'm going to share my screen. I am going to kind of go in the order of how I deliver this assignment in the course. So I'm going to start actually with some backup and context, and then I'll show you some examples and then end with some questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I realized I didn't put my email address on here, but I am in the New School email. It's just chamanyk@newschool.edu in case you want to reach out to me afterwards. And so as the title, one of the things that I really gain from this is not only, the joy of reading these every week, is that I really get to customize the learning for each student, which is why I call this metacognition and customized conversations. So here's, again, my reasoning for why. I'm trying to engage with every student. I'm trying to customize that learning. When I say customized learning, it's not just learning challenges. So many students are very strong students, and when they submit their journal, you can tell they're engaging at multiple levels. Higher order thinking is happening. They actually need more. They need more advanced learning. They need to be challenged. This is particularly true, I think, in the first year program, where you have such a diversity of students coming in with different levels of preparation, different abilities to engage with college level learning. And so what I mean by tools is sometimes I'm giving students new tools that they've never had before, even though they might be a very advanced note taker or learner, especially if I'm asking them to do more visual thinking or visual learning and they're more text-based. Sometimes the students are struggling with just how to even manage time or the assignment or how to approach the assignment. So sometimes the methods are much more pedagogical. And then a lot of times what I'm learning about the student is what is exciting them about the course material or their connections across the curriculum. And therefore, I sometimes even give them additional resources that's more content-based or skills-based. So it might have to do with a very specific subject or topic of that week. So that's part of the reason why I employed the journal assignment. What is it? So Debasmita, I love that you said the word journal really captured your attention. I want to say that this is not a typical personal journal entry. So at Lang, many times faculty will ask students to journal every week, and it's extremely personal and emotional. This journal entry that I've designed is really focused on learning. So there can be personal and emotional, obviously that's the holistic student information there, but it's really about how they're approaching their learning and how that approach is developing or changing over time. So that's really the kind of journal entry it is, and you'll see that in some of the journal prompts that I'll share with you. It is done in my class weekly. I have done it every other week. Students tend to forget when things are every other week or every third week, so I've just kind of stopped doing that and made it a shorter entry and just every week, and that way they know it's every week. I do allow them to skip 2 during the course of the semester. So that gives them a little bit of leeway in case they forget or they have a busy week or they don't really have anything to submit that week. What I want to do now is kind of switch gears and tell you some of the things I do very briefly. I'm just going to list them. We can come back to it in the Q&A if you're interested. Of things that I do that actually make this assignment, I think, successful in my class, which are other assignments or other engagement tools that I use at the beginning of the first third of the class. And that really helps prepare the student for the assignment. So here are the things that I do in advance. So I do a visual thinking strategies on the very first day of class and or orientation week for my first year students. So they look at this mural by Roscoe, which is called Gods of the Modern World. It's actually in Dartmouth College's library. And the visual thinking strategies is a elementary primary school technique where you asked the participants, what do you see? Why do you say that? And tell me more. The reason why I do this is I want the students to really sense that the classroom is a community of individuals who may have very distinct and unique lived experiences, interests, and lens through which they see the world. And this really helps them sort of start to engage with dialogue with each other because now they're not strangers anymore. So this is kind of an important piece that builds that classroom community. The second thing I do, sometimes I do this in lieu of this, or sometimes I do it in addition, is I have every student actually fill out their Canvas profile. I don't know how many of you have actually looked at the people on your Canvas. When you look there, you can actually click on, and I think I have to do new share for you to see this. You can click on the person's image and you'll see that, in this case, this is Nadja. She's one of my past students and goes by she and they. And she wrote a little biography based on some prompts I gave them, and then her contact information. And sometimes students will put a lot of links to Instagram and social down here, or projects, or their learning portfolio. And this way the students are starting to get to know each other one-on-one because they actually have to read each other's biographies and communicate with each other on the discussion thread. So that's another thing that I do in advance of the metacognitive assignment. The other thing that I do is, this is something that Rita is very familiar with because we worked on this together. This is a Google form that I created, which is, I call it More About You. This is really helping me understand the student's prior experience and any personal values or community or individual interests that might impact the way they learn, whether that might influence their learning in a positive way or negative way or present unique challenges. If you're interested in that, you can click on the Google form and you can look at that form. I can also provide it to you as the back end, so you can see all the questions without having to fill it out. And then the last assignment is 3 artworks of developmental impact. And I do this assignment for 2 reasons. I do this in the first year course for the students, again, to get to know each other and see each other as a collaborative community. Each student is asked to pick 3 artworks that had an incredible impact on them at 3 different times in their lives. And then they present those. So we start with about 2 to 3 students each class for the first 3 weeks of the class. So for every class session for the first 3 weeks, there are at least 3 students presenting themselves in this way. And it's really helpful for the students because, again, they start to be more metacognitive about how their past experiences impact their learning in this space and on this campus. And then the last thing I give them is a seminar tips document, which, again, if you're interested, you can click on the PDF and look at this. This gives them roles, and it also gives them quite a bit of context and tools on how to engage in dialogue. This is particularly important post-COVID, I think, because so many students have social anxiety and are struggling to be in a large group in discussion, really in particular about discussion where you have to bring up critical ideas without critiquing the person. So this can be a very helpful thing. So this is all sort of groundwork before they do this assignment on the sort of metacognitive journal. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about how I deliver the journal, the nuts and bolts of this, how often. So again, I do this weekly, and this is really to help them develop a habit of mind and see this as an ongoing practice. I also emphasize for them that this is something they could do in any class, regardless of whether somebody is assigning it to them or not, and that it's useful for them in creating what we call enduring understandings in any course. The delivery that I use is the online Canvas learning management software. The format varies depending on the course level and the role that I want the assignment to play in a particular course, as well as where it is landing during the semester. So as I said, because I do this through, a weekly, it's up to 15 journal entries. I usually don't do it the first week, and I don't do it the last week, and I don't do it at midterm. So it's about 12 entries, 12 to 13 entries. If I'm about halfway through the course and I know that there is some content that's particularly challenging, I might actually customize that particular set of journal prompts. So that's what I mean by it depends on the delivery, timing of the delivery in a course. So sometimes it's about those muddiest points for a challenging issue, or if it's a low-level course, it might be less structured or highly structured depending on the student background. So what are they actually providing? So many students choose to write a text response. Others really feel much more comfortable with a video response, and Canvas allows you to do that. Others do mixed media, where I get images or songs or music or paintings, all sorts of artwork, as well as text, as well as sometimes images of themselves doing the work or being challenged by the work. So it's a real range of delivery in terms of format for the student response. I tend to respond to the student in the Canvas comments based on the format they give me. So if they give me a video response, I give them a video response. If they're giving me images and text, I try to respond in kind so that I'm really sort of meeting them where they are. The really important thing for them to understand is that this journal entry is only viewable to me and no one else in the classroom. It's a private space. No other student can see it. No academic fellow, no peer fellow, no teaching assistants. So this is really for me to develop a very one-on-one relationship with the student. I do grade it because I think it is valid, and I think metacognition is part of learning. So I make a big deal about this and I explain that to them. And depending on the course, it might count as 10 or 20% of their grade, and it counts towards their participation in the class. This is particularly important for students, as Lucci said, who are really quiet. So I actually will count this as their participation. Some students say to me, I don't want to participate in seminar every week or ever. And so I ask them in the journal comments, am I permitted to share your work with the class anonymously? If they say yes, I might project an image or a quote that they've shared with me. I'll usually tell them which part I'm going to share. And then I'll project it in class, and that's their way of contributing to classroom discussion without having to sort of disclose their identity or speak or draw on the board or anything in class that might give them discomfort. So this is one way to sort of allow for different forms of participation. And that's what I mean by bringing it back into the classroom. So that's the anonymous piece. Okay, so let me now give some quick examples of what this might look like. So on this link up at the top, I have 3 different examples. And then I should say that you can also do something as simple as this. Like to a prompt about how are you learning, you could write, what is one thing you will continue to do? What is one thing you want to start doing? It can be as simple as that, and you will get so much information from the student. But I'm going to show you some examples that I've worked up in my practice by clicking on this link, which you have access to, and I will do new share. So this is a Google Doc I created, and it's visible to anybody with a new school email. And what you can see here is I give a little background on why I do this. So very similar to what I'm presenting here in this faculty development seminar. I tell you why I'm doing it. And then here's the example of one that I did for the HEOP program. So I'll make it a little bigger so you can see it. In this case, this is a very unusual experience for students making the transition between high school and college. So my questions are really about that transition and the course that I've created for them. So it's really about how do you balance, time management? How do you balance your home responsibilities with work and things like that? For my first year students, the questions are quite different, but they are really focused on how they are learning. This is sort of important to really emphasize because when students see the word journal, as Deb Asmita said, they sometimes think it's like a diary where they're just talking about their emotions, which is great, but I want to really know much more about how they're approaching their learning. So I give them some prompts and I tell them, you don't have to answer all of these questions, only those that pertain to you or that work for you. You can answer this as an open-ended paragraph, a drawing, a mind map. You can address this as the list of questions if that's easier for you, as a set of answers. So one thing that surprised them or got them excited, that's really important to me in terms of engagement. What was their approach to the learning for this week? This to me is very insightful as an instructor. Sometimes I'll hear that the students are approaching their learning, at midnight the day before the class. So that's, a moment for intervention to tell them that, enduring and understandings usually require multiple contacts at different times. And I teach them a little bit about memory and how memory develops from short-term to long-term memory. I ask them what's enjoyable, what's challenging, and how they meet the challenge. In other words, did they run away? Did they did they put the stuff away? Did they try to identify resources? Did they reach out to the learning center? What did they do? Did they reach out to a peer or an academic fellow, teaching assistant, something? What connections did you make to your other learning? This is incredibly important for me, especially for first year, because my course isn't about the content. It's about learning how to be a liberal arts student. So it's really important that they're sort of making those cross-disciplinary, cross-curricular connections. And sometimes I'll ask them also, like, how does this connect to the community in which you live and work? That's also very important to me. And then, of course, this gets at sort of the emotional context. So those are some examples from the first year here. For the first year class at Lang, it's a little different. I give them much more scaffolding. So I tell them why I'm giving them scaffolding. So I do really spend quite a bit of time explaining the assignment. And then you can see that there's just a lot more detail in the questions. I'll try to make it a little bigger. So in this course, I'm doing a lot on visual narrative. So this particular course has some specificity about that. I do ask them which practices they would maintain, which they would do differently. Again, how they're feeling, how this is influencing other aspects of their life, including movements or activism or policies. That's very important for our Lang students in particular. Is there an image, social media post, artwork that captures some of your reflections? So I asked them also to give me feedback on how things can improve in the course. This is another example of how it's evolved. So I tried to give a little bit more color-coded highlights because they sometimes get overwhelmed with too many questions. So this is more context, deadline and frequency, format, asynchronous time, purpose. This was particularly important during COVID. I'm telling them that I really want to create a dialogue. So I want them to go back and look at the comments that I've written and then respond. So it's a back and forth. I tell them some of the cognitive science research that informs this assignment, and that's really important for them. And then here, the prompts are organized a little differently. So content, how they're approaching their learning, and then affect. So it's really the three different levels of Bloom's cognitive affect at different levels at lower and higher order thinking. So those are just some of the examples. You can look at them, more detail on your own because you have access to this through the PowerPoint, which I'm happy to attach to the chat and also email to you if you're interested. So I'll stop there because that was a lot and see if there are any questions or places in need of elaboration. I don't know if there are comments or questions. Anybody feel free to chime in.
Thank you, Katayoun. So when you're prompting, I think I may freeze, so I have my camera off. When you are assigning the prompts or assigning the assignment, are you asking them how many of them are they requested or required to respond to on a weekly basis? Are they taking one pointer, or taking one scaffold, or taking one
Yeah.
session?
You
What
know,
does it look like?
that's a good question, Lucci. My students tend to get very overwhelmed very quickly. And so what I tell them is you can answer, one question if that really speaks to you. And if they tend to always answer, like in the first 3 weeks, first 3 entries, all their responses are very emotional and they're not saying anything about how they're approaching their learning or the course content or making any connections to their world around them, I will then in my comments encourage them. And I will say, do you notice that here are some prompts here about how you're approaching your learning or the material or other courses? And as much as I can, I try to customize that. So for instance, if a student is speaking very emotionally about how they're struggling in all of their classes, and then in particular in mine or less in mine, I'll say to them, that's so interesting. Thank you for sharing. Is there actually material or content or tools that you're learning here that could be transposed to the other courses? So I try to make it much more of a dialogue rather than just pointing them back to the set of questions, but then reminding them that the prompts do allow them to elaborate in those areas. If by the 6th or 7th entry, they still have not addressed learning specifically, I will ask them directly in my comments to say, I love these, responses. This is really helpful in helping me know who you are and what you're thinking about. However, I'm an educator and I'm really interested in learning about how you're learning. So please, in your next journal entry, please at least address some aspect of that. So I really try to keep it open-ended. I should say some students write 2 pages, like 1,000 words, even though I only ask for 300. Other students just answer the questions. They don't do a free write. And some students really don't feel comfortable with text at all. And they just give me images. Like, this reminded me of this song. And then I have to kind of engage with them in the comments to say, that's great. How did that song help you learn the material? So it's sort of a back and forth trying to encourage them to think a little bit more deeply about their learning. So I really appreciate that question.
I'm curious, do they actually do that feedback to your feedback? It's something that I've tried to encourage, but I don't try to enforce it. And so I find that maybe students will do it once and then they're just happy to take all my feedback and not continue the conversation. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's also a really great comment. And I will say that in my own experience, the students who tend to come to office hours also tend to be the ones that engage in dialogue on the Canvas. So it's always the usual suspects. However, there are always 1 or 2 students who are incredibly quiet, who will never come to meet me, even when I stop them and say, please come and meet me outside of class. I'm really interested in what you're thinking. They will engage in dialogue, but sometimes I have to remind them. So in addition to putting the comment in Canvas, I might also send them a personal email through the Canvas messaging system and say, I don't know if you noticed that I wrote a comment to your to your journal entry, and I'm really interested to know what you thought of that. Sometimes that helps them, but you're right, it's like extra work and it's an extra step and it is a reminder. I too have been loath to sort of mandate dialogue. I feel like, well, dialogue should come. And if I am not fostering it, then I just need to figure out what to do to foster it better instead of making it a requirement. But I love that question.
Yeah, Katayoun, thank you for the presentation. I have 2 questions. One is, you mentioned at one point, like depending on what the students are writing, sometimes you talk to the students and talk to them about learning in general. Like, for example, the specific example you gave, that if you see that that student is starting working on the materials the night before the class, then you talk to them and talk about like the different touch points,
Yeah.
when they. So do you ever share any resources with them in terms of any research articles or probably a practitioner piece with them, which kind of like enhances that discussion? And number 2 is, I saw that this journaling is a part of the final grade, right? If I understand that correctly.
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm.
So is it possible, or I don't know if you do that, is it possible, like, for example, in my class, I kind of like, a part of the final grade comes from students' participation. But as you mentioned, depending on the student, if they're introvert, if they don't like, if they're quiet, sometimes they don't speak up that much in the class,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So is it possible that, we can have two form of student participation?
Well, that's what I do. So I basically, if the student never speaks in class, I will count their journals as participation. But in those cases, I try to encourage the student to allow me to share components with the class anonymously. So for instance, a lot of students will actually say, this reminds me of something I read in XX class, or this reminds me of this artwork. And so then I'll present the artwork in class if the student says it's okay. Then that's, in my view, a way that the student has contributed to the classroom discussion, because they're making a connection to something that has meaning and value and might connect to the content or the methodology that's being presented. In terms of resources, I absolutely share resources with students. So this is what I mean by customized. So again, the more advanced students actually can get more, they can, in your case, research articles, journal articles, peer-reviewed articles. In the case of my classes, which often involve art, also, I will point them to other artists in particular, other practitioners. Those who are interested in social justice, for instance, I point them to activist movements or petitions or policies that they might be interested in following. So it really depends on the student and also the course, but absolutely, that's the beauty of this, is you can really give them a lot of resources. And this is particularly important for a course, I think, in which they're doing an independent project, where, they might be doing a final project in a particular area on a topic that they've chosen, but the idea is that they're supposed to be doing their own research, right? Sometimes they need a little guidance with that research. So this is a place where you can actually do some of that as well. So I know that a couple of you are in the first, like dealing with first year, like John, I'm just curious if you do something like this, or if you see some pitfalls in this approach, or something you might want to modify.
I think, you'd mentioned the learning portfolio, and this is sort of a way that we tend to use it, but I think it's really different when it's not this kind of habit forming, right? That there's sort of a practice, often it's this, depending on the faculty, it's sort of a kind of summative moment. You get to the end of a project, and some faculty use it more like this, where their students are really posting as they go, and they can kind of see how their learning is changing over a series of posts, but nothing sort of unified in this way. One thing I think that's so, I love I understand like the challenges of that dialogue, because I face that too when I'm in Canvas and I'm giving them all of this copious feedback, and then it's like, hello, it's crickets. So it's like I sort of I long for that kind of dialogue, especially because I think the thing that we often see are those students who are so quiet have a lot to say, and it's like you see it all kind of opening up in this format, like they really have a lot to add, and you want, if it were in class and they were speaking, you would be able to have that dialogue. And yet when you're in this Canvas format, it's like this kind of one-way delivery system where they put something, you put something, transaction is over. So I think finding ways maybe to prolong that would be interesting.
Yeah, I think, like I said, one of the things I do is I do sort of ping them, and let them know that there's a post, because I think they're just overwhelmed with like how much, Canvas sends them all these, notifications, or they turn them all off, right? It's like sort of all or nothing. And so sometimes I'll just email them outside. I'm an unusual faculty member, and then I have many of my students on cell phone. So I use WhatsApp, I use text to kind of let them know, hey, I've posted something on Canvas. Why don't you take a look? And that tends to work much better than email, but that's a personal boundary I have chosen to utilize, just because I think I can connect to my students faster and more quickly.
That makes sense.
I will also sometimes say at the beginning of class, hi, just reminding you, you have your weekly journal, but I'm responding. And so if you haven't looked at my responses, it might be useful for you to look there, just as a reminder. So sometimes I do a general reminder too. Yeah.
John, I actually think in terms of first year, whether or not it's as robust as the journal that Katayoun has outlined, which I think is fantastic and would be incredibly powerful for first year students, but even adopting some of those prompt practices, like at the beginning of the class or at the end of a class, and even if you're not collecting them, ask students to just self-reflect for a couple of minutes. Even that can be really helpful and is a baby step into the kind of work that Katayoun has described.
The other thing is, Rita, I think there are lots of templates for those. If people want to just adopt them, they're called classroom assessments or 1-minute papers. Sometimes they're called 1-minute papers. And I've had actually other faculty, especially some of our part-time faculty, who really find Canvas very distancing. They just bring in 3x5 note cards or Post-its, and they just have the students write down 3 responses. One thing I'm going to continue doing, one thing that surprised me, one thing that was challenging. Or they might do it at the end of the class and say, one thing that remains unclear, one thing that I now understand better, or one thing that made me shift my point of view. And so those can be immediately obtained, and then you can flip through them and then sort of shape the next class based on this collective thing. So yeah, those are really great. Rita, I always want to do them and I always run out of time. So the reason why I kind of went to this is at least I know this will get done and I will have time to look at it on a Friday at the end of the week, when I have time and joy to sit down and really pour through it. So directly. The other thing I should say is for our first year courses at Lang, the first year seminars are also considered advising seminars. So this actually I count these journal entries as part of the advising experience. The students are supposed to come and see me once or twice a semester, but I sometimes just can't get them to come to see me ever, like not even on Zoom. And so at least this way I'm doing some academic advising with them and helping them think about their liberal learning.